Have you ever looked into the eyes of a child who had nothing left to lose? Would you still walk away if that child was not even human? Marshall, Kane had seen 1,000 battlefields and watched just as many promises crumble to ash, but nothing in his decades of war prepared him for the silence on Gorath IV. The planet was supposed to be empty, a war zone picked clean by both scavengers and time. Its red soil stretched out in waves like a sea of rust, broken only by the blackened ribs of collapsed towers and craters where buildings once stood. He stepped through the dust, his boots sinking slightly with each slow step. There was no wind, no birds, no machines, only the creak of his own gear and the soft grind of old metal beneath his feet. The sun above burned dim behind the thick amber haze, and every breath tasted like copper and ash. The wreckage was familiar to him. All war zones shared the same language. Twisted metal, scorched walls, signs that people had once lived and died here. But today something felt off. Marshall was not the kind of man to get feelings about places. He trusted maps, schematics, mission logs. But this morning, when his old freighter touched down, something stirred in his gut. The silence was not just silence. It was waiting. He moved deeper into the ruins, guided by instinct, not protocol. His HUD displayed no life signs, but he kept his pulse rifle slung, ready, out of habit. Then, behind a jagged support beam, he saw it. Not movement, not noise, something else. Eyes. 2 pale silver eyes peered out from the darkness, too still to be animal, too clear to be natural. A face followed, small, almost doll-like, covered in soot. A child, no older than 7. She had skin the faint blue of moonlight and hair that was white-tangled and matted with debris. Her thin frame pressed into the shadow like she hoped to disappear completely. She didn't run. She didn't speak. She didn't even blink. Marshall's first instinct was caution. He'd seen traps disguised as children before. In war, anything soft could be sharpened into a weapon. But something about the way she didn't flinch broke through his armor more than any ambush ever had. He lowered his rifle slowly, squatting to her level. She flinched just a little, just a twitch of the shoulder. But she held his gaze. "What are you doing here?" he asked softly. No response. Just those silver eyes watching him as if memorizing his every breath. She was barefoot, her toes curled against the cold metal floor. A faded piece of cloth clung to her shoulders, and he noticed how her ribs pushed out too far from beneath her skin. Starvation not recent. This child had been alone for days, maybe weeks, maybe longer. He reached into his pack and pulled out a sealed protein bar, breaking it in half before offering it across the space between them. She didn't move. "It's food," he said, "not a trick." She blinked once, then slowly, so slowly she extended a hand, taking it like it might vanish at any second. Her fingers trembled as she brought the food to her mouth. Then she devoured it, like a creature untrained in eating. The first bite made her wince, but she kept going until it was gone. Her eyes never left him. Marshall Kane had been alone for years, since his discharge, since his daughter died, since the world lost its color. But this child, this blue-skinned girl with eyes like quiet galaxies, had stirred something inside him. Something he thought he'd buried. He reached into his pack again, this time, pulling a small thermal blanket and draped it gently over her shoulders. She didn't protest, didn't flinch again. She just clutched it tightly with shaking fingers and leaned her head to one side, like a bird learning to trust the wind. "Do you have a name?" he asked. She didn't answer, but after a moment she tilted her head again and whispered so faintly he almost didn't hear Lyra. It wasn't a name he recognized, not from any Varelian dialect or known species. It was her name. She gave it to herself, or perhaps clung to it. From a time before, Marshall stood slowly scanning the area again, nothing but wreckage and silence. But now that silence had a witness. He tapped his comm. No trace of military signals, no sign of pursuit, no reason to linger and every reason to leave. And yet he stayed. He looked down at her, Lyra sitting amid ruins, too large for her body, her face too tired for her age, and he made a decision. He wasn't sure why, but in the end, sometimes a man doesn't choose what saves him. Sometimes it chooses him. The ship's doors sealed with a quiet hiss, blocking out the last remnants of Gorath 4's orange haze. Inside, the lights glowed low and soft, casting long shadows across the aging interior of Marshal Kane's freighter. The girl sat curled in the auxiliary seat near the wall, blanket still wrapped around her like armor. She hadn't spoken since the name. Lyra. A single word, a whisper, and then nothing. Kane busied himself with the ship's startup sequence, hands moving with the muscle memory of years, but his eyes kept drifting back to the girl. Every so often, she would glance toward the controls, not with fear, but with quiet curiosity, like someone trying to piece together a language from the pauses between words. Most kids he had met cried, or screamed, or clung to the first warm body they saw, not her. She sat still, too still, like she was waiting for permission to exist. He adjusted the course away from the central trade lanes, choosing a path through the unregulated corridor between star clusters. Less chance of patrols, less chance of anyone asking questions. He had learned long ago that when you wanted to disappear, you didn't run toward safety. You ran toward silence. After an hour, she finally moved. Not much, just a shift of her legs. Then her voice came again, thin and careful. "Is this your ship?" He glanced over. Her eyes were fixed on a flickering panel near the door. "Yeah," he said, "mine for about 10 years. Is it safe?" The question hit him harder than it should have. He thought about lying, thought about promising her something he couldn't deliver. But he respected honesty too much to pretend. "No ship's ever really safe," he said. "But it's safer than where we were." She nodded slowly, as if that answer made sense to her. She didn't ask more. He stood and walked toward the galley compartment, pulling a small tray from the rehydrator. Soup, or something like it. The auto-nutrient packs weren't known for flavor, but they were warm, and they kept your blood from freezing. He placed it gently on the fold-down table in front of her. Eat it slow. He said, her silence thick around them. She stared for a second, then obeyed. Each spoonful seemed to cost her a decision. Her hands shook just a little less now. Between bites, she finally asked the question he'd been expecting. "Why did you help me?" He sat across from her elbows on the table, chin in hand. "Because you looked like you needed it." "Nobody ever helps me," she said, "not. Since the fire, not since the soldiers." "What soldiers?" She didn't answer. Instead, her breathing slowed her gaze, falling to the surface of the soup as if it held memories she couldn't say out loud. He didn't press. He'd learned with trauma you didn't force the lock. You waited until the person handed you the key. "You have anywhere to go?" he asked. "No. Any family?" "Gone." He nodded once and leaned back in his seat, letting the silence return. He was good at silence. It had been his companion, longer than any friend I had a daughter. He said softly, "She died a long time ago." Lyra looked up, a flicker of something in her eyes. "What was her name?" "Marin," he said, barely above a whisper. She was loud, laughed a lot, like the stars were telling her jokes no one else could hear. "What happened to her? Same thing that happens to most people you love in war," he said. And then he left it there. She didn't speak again, but this time the silence between them felt different. Less like a wall, more like a space waiting to be filled. The ship slipped into hyperspace and the stars stretched out like threads pulled tight. Kane dimmed the cabin lights and let the stars shine, Lyra curled up again, this time with the blanket pulled tighter and her head resting against the edge of the seat. He watched her breathe, steady, slow. She's just a kid, he thought, a child caught in a fire. She didn't start living in a galaxy that never planned for her. He stood and moved to the control panel, adjusting life support settings, increasing humidity by a fraction, fixing the gravity to be just a touch gentler. Small things, quiet things, the kind a father would do without thinking. She didn't belong in this world, but maybe, just maybe, she belonged in his. Have you ever wondered what ghosts look like in space? Not the kind that rattle chains or whisper in dark corridors, but the ones that wear uniforms, speak in official tones, and remind you of rules you thought you'd buried. Marshal Kane knew this kind well. He had once worn their colors. Now they were on his screen, blinking red and blue as a patrol ship hailed him. This is Border Enforcement Vessel, Delta 3. Please identify and prepare for boarding. Kane muted the channel and looked toward Lyra. She sat still, her eyes wide, shoulders tucked inward, like she knew exactly what was about to happen. He didn't panic, he didn't rush. Instead, he stood and moved with the same methodical rhythm that had once earned him the nickname Cold Iron Kane. He didn't feel cold now. He felt something heavier. He moved to the console and keyed in a random alignment drift. Just enough to look like a nav error, not enough to trigger suspicion. From there, he activated a masking field, a relic from his smuggling days, long retired but still functional in short bursts. They're scanning us, Lyra, he said, not whispering but not loud either. Will they take me? He didn't answer because he didn't lie. Instead, he slid a panel aside behind the auxiliary coolant tank, revealing a hollow space lined with shielding. It wasn't comfortable, but it was safe. He nodded toward it. Get in. Stay quiet. No matter what. She obeyed without a word, slipping inside and curling up, knees to chest, like she had done it before. He sealed the panel and took a long breath before answering the hail freighter. Vega? 12? This is Captain Marshal Kane. Cargo salvage only headed for repair dock in the outer rim. There was silence for a moment, then the voice returned. Copy that, Vega, 12. You've been flagged for inspection. Hold position and prepare for docking. Kane killed the line and sat back, eyes closed. A few minutes later, the docking clamps echoed through the ship like distant thunder, the hiss of pressure equalizing the thud of boots on metal. Then voices, cold, formal voices. Kane rose to meet them. He kept his posture relaxed but alert, an old soldier's stance. The two officers stepped aboard, one tall and sharp, one shorter, with a data pad already scanning Marshal Kane. The tall one asked formally of Omega Sector Recon. That was a long time ago, Kane said, and now you're flying a rust bucket across dead space picking up junk. Salvage work's honest enough. The officer looked past him, scanning the interior before stepping forward and starting his sweep. The second stayed behind, flicking through logs. Your destination. Outer Rim. Industrial. Dock 7. Kane replied, cargo manifest, empty except for ration packs and engine coolant. The officer grunted and moved to the galley. He paused at the table, then at the storage bay, then the bunk. He didn't go near the auxiliary panel. Not yet, you fly alone. Usually, the officer turned and looked at him long and hard, then back at his partner. Let's wrap this up. We're not finding anything worth the fuel. But just as they turned to leave, the shorter officer froze. This ship was flagged 2 cycles ago for proximity to an alien orphan retrieval sector. Kane's heart didn't skip. He'd trained it not to. That, so must be a lot of ships flagged nowadays. Not exactly peaceful times. Still, the officer said, mind if we take a quick peek in the secondary bay, it's sealed. Unseal it. Kane moved slower than necessary, keying in a false error code. Hydraulics are stuck. You'll need cutters. The officer frowned, then looked at his partner. Not worth it. The taller one said, "They're not hiding anything here a beat." Then the shorter one nodded and turned away. They left without another word. Kane didn't breathe until he heard the docking clamps release, and the ship detached from the patrol vessel, drifting once again into the black. He waited 10 more minutes before opening the panel. Lyra uncurled slowly, blinking in the dim light. "They're gone," she whispered. "Yeah. Did they know?" "Maybe." "Then why didn't they take me?" He looked at her, then sat down on the floor across from her, leaning his back against the wall. Because sometimes people choose not to see what would make them human again, and sometimes they do. He smiled a little. "You're still with me." She stared for a long moment, then crawled out from the hiding place and sat beside him, pulling the blanket tighter around her. "I don't want to hide anymore," she said. He looked out the viewport, watching stars slide past like quiet memories. "Then maybe it's time we stop running and start living again. Have you ever sat across from someone and realized they were watching the world from behind a wall? They didn't build. Not with fear, but with distance, the kind forged by pain. Too old for words, Kane knew that look. He'd worn it once too. Now it lived in Lyra's eyes, not accusing, not begging. Just there, like a shadow under her skin. The ship drifted through neutral space slow and silent. Kane had set it to low-power glide mode, coasting between trade lanes like a ghost, following old star lines. He sat in the common cabin, watching the girl from across the room, not speaking, not moving, just being present with her in the quiet. Lyra had not spoken much since the encounter with the patrol. Her posture had changed, though a little straighter, less ready to disappear. She still flinched at unexpected sounds, but not as often. She no longer ate like she expected the food to vanish before her fingers reached it. Small things. Quiet signs. Kane handed her a piece of fruit, preserved but not synthetic. The kind that left a faint sweetness on the air. She took it with both hands and examined it like it might be alive. "It's from Belleron," he said. "They grow in red soil, too, like Gorath." Her eyes lifted slowly toward his but said nothing. She bit the fruit cautiously, then chewed slow. Deliberate. Her gaze softened with the second bite. "Do you miss your daughter?" she asked suddenly. Kane didn't flinch. He nodded once. Every day. What was she like? He leaned back and looked up at the cabin ceiling, as if the answer might be written there. Marin was loud, not just in voice. She had this way of being present, like a star in a dark room. You always knew where she was, because you felt lighter for it. Lyra held the fruit in both hands, quietly absorbing the image. "Do I remind you of her?" He thought about that. A long moment passed before he answered. "No," he said. "You remind me of who I used to be before I forgot how to listen." Lyra blinked as if unsure what that meant. She turned the fruit in her hand, then took another bite. "What happened to her?" He paused, then spoke without blinking. "She was on a colony transport. It got caught between two factions. Some rogue mercenaries trying to send a message. They blew the ship apart before it reached the station. No survivors. Lyra didn't speak, but she moved a little closer. Not much. Just enough to close the space between the wall and the seat, between the silence and the memory. I used to think about revenge," he said. "Used to plan it every night in my head, names, places, weapons. Then I realized the only person that kept me company during those nights was the man who died the day I lost her." Lyra leaned her head against the metal wall. "I dream about fire," she whispered, "about my mother. Her voice. Her hands. Do you remember her face? Only when I close my eyes do you want to remember." She nodded once, like it cost her more than she could explain. He stood slowly and walked to the rear of the cabin, returning with a small object. A memory stone, smooth dark with faint runes pulsing on its surface. "This can help," he said. "Place your hand on it. Let it guide you." Lyra hesitated but took it, cradled it in her palms like a fragile creature. Her eyes closed and her breathing deepened. The stone glowed faintly. Kane watched her expression shift. Soften, a single tear rolled down her cheek and he looked away, not to intrude. When she opened her eyes again, she looked older. Not in years, but in presence, like someone who had touched something sacred and returned. "Thank you," she said. "You don't have to carry it alone anymore," he replied. They sat in the dim cabin while the stars outside moved in silence. Kane reached for a cup of warm synth tea and handed it to her. She accepted it, both hands again. "What are we going to do now?" she asked. "We keep moving to wherever we can make something matter again. Have you ever felt a presence before you saw it? Not footsteps, not sound, just a weight in the air like something was watching you from just outside the edges of reality." That's what Kane felt the moment the transmission came through. He was at the nav console recalibrating drift when the signal flickered in weak, stuttering a ghost across the ComNet grid. At first, he thought it was just static, but Lyra stood in the doorway, eyes locked on the screen like she had heard it before. "What is that?" she asked. He turned up the audio, faint broken tones layered beneath the distortion. Then a word pushed through, barely audible but unmistakable. "Lyra." Kane froze. The signal repeated. The same frequency, the same broken voice. It wasn't her voice, but it knew her name. Lyra was trembling. He stood between her and the console, instinctively protective. "You know what that is?" he asked. She nodded barely. "It's them." He didn't have to ask who. The Order Kane had heard of them, even during the wars. Ghost stories about a faction that didn't operate under any flag. Silent interrogators who harvested knowledge more than territory. Their reach extended across borders and their name was never officially recorded. Yet survivors sometimes spoke in whispers. Eyes wide, hands shaking. Lyra sat down slowly, her eyes never leaving the screen. "They trained me," she said softly. "Not to fight, to listen. To go into minds and extract what they couldn't say out loud. You're a reader," he said quietly. She nodded once. "I was one of their best." Until I stopped. Kane didn't press. Instead, he pulled up the signal map, tracing the source back through relays, dead systems, broken satellites, until he found the origin. A medical research station near the rim of the old Varelian corridor, long since abandoned according to records. "Why would they be calling you now?" he asked. "Because I left," she said, "and they never let go." Hayne clenched his jaw. He had spent years running from old orders, old ghosts. But this was something else. The transmission played again, softer this time. "Lyra, come home." He shut it off and turned to her. "We're not going back." She didn't answer, but her hands were tight fists in her lap. "What do you want to do?" he asked her. "I want to know if the voice is real, so you want to go there." "No," she said, "I need to." He didn't like it, but he respected it. "Then we go." The freighter banked hard, recalibrating its course for the abandoned station. The stars outside shifted their lines, turning slowly toward a past neither of them fully understood. On the journey, Lyra spent more time in silence than ever. Kane noticed her face change. Not in age, but in depth, like someone remembering a language they've promised to forget. The closer they got to the station, the colder the ship felt. Not in temperature, but in spirit, like the air was holding its breath. The station appeared on the edge of the black. A ring of broken metal, orbiting a dead moon. No lights, no beacons. Just a flickering signal still repeating her name, Lyra. He landed the ship gently near a fractured docking array. The clamps groaned as if waking from a long sleep. "You sure about this?" Kane asked one last time. No, she said, but I have to. He armed himself but didn't offer her a weapon. She didn't need one. Not her kind. They stepped out into the station. Air, stale lights flickering. A long hallway stretched into shadow. The walls were covered in old markings, Varelian runes mostly, but beneath them, newer symbols etched like scars. They walked in silence. Only the sound of their boots against metal and the hum of failing systems guiding them. At the end of the corridor, a door stood partially ajar. Beyond it, Kane could sense something not alive, but aware, like the room itself was watching. She stepped forward. It's a memory chamber, she said. They kept your thoughts here and pieces of me. He stayed beside her eyes, scanning every corner. You don't have to go in alone. She looked at him, then, for the first time, reached out her hand. I know they entered together. Inside the chamber, the air felt thicker, like walking into a dream half-remembered. The walls pulsed faintly with pale blue light, forming the outlines of neural projectors, long dormant but not dead. Kane held his breath as Lyra stepped forward toward the central console. Her presence seemed to awaken the room. The lights sharpened. The air began to hum, and the floor beneath their feet shifted almost imperceptibly, as if the station itself was remembering her. She reached out with both hands, placing them on the interface. The room responded immediately, a low-frequency thrum echoing through Kane's chest, and then the light surrounded her. Kane stepped back, watching as her eyes unfocused, her posture relaxed, and her breathing slowed. She didn't fall asleep. She was falling inward. He didn't speak. He knew this wasn't a place for voices. This was a place for echoes. Images began to flicker across the walls, faint at first, then stronger. Scenes from Lyra's childhood intercut with moments Kane didn't recognize. Training sessions, medical scans, dozens of people in white robes observing her like a specimen, not a child. She didn't flinch. Then came the darker scenes. Rooms without windows, long corridors screaming, not from pain but confusion and betrayal. People dragged in and out, never speaking again. One image held longer than the others. A woman, perhaps Lyra's mother, reaching for her through a glass wall, just before she was pulled away. The last thing she said was not a word but a gesture. A hand over her heart and a single nod. Lyra fell to her knees, but the light held her upright. Memories didn't just return, they demanded to be felt. Then the voice came again, not from the speakers but from the air itself. You were made for more. It was calm, smooth male, and utterly devoid of warmth. You ran because you were afraid. Now you return because you need us. Lyra shook her head slowly. I returned because I remembered. And what did you remember? That I was a child before? I was a tool, that I was a person before. I was your weapon. The light intensified the pressure in the room, increasing. Kane stepped forward, unable to stand still. You're not taking her, he said loudly, his voice firm, but the room didn't acknowledge him. Lyra stood slowly, her eyes glowing faintly with the light around her. You taught me how to enter minds, she said softly, but you never expected me to defend my own. With that, the lights flared and the projectors began to short one by one like overloaded memories collapsing under their own weight. The room pulsed once and then dimmed. She fell back, but Kane caught her, holding her upright as the systems around them shut down. The voice tried to return, weak, distorted. We made you. She opened her eyes and whispered, and I remade myself. Kane helped her to her feet, and together they moved back down the hallway, the station around them dimming with every step. As they boarded the freighter, the station released its final breath, a low hum fading into silence. Once inside, Kane sat her down gently in the co-pilot seat. You all right? She nodded slowly. I know who I am now, and who's that? Someone they don't own. Kane looked at her, and for the first time saw not just a survivor, but a spark, a light untouched by the darkness that tried to consume it. He smiled slightly. "Welcome back, kid." The freighter glided silently away from the dark shell of the station, its hull dimly lit by the fading remnants of its dying systems. Kane didn't engage full thrust. He let them drift for a while, letting the silence wrap around them like a blanket. Some moments didn't need engines, they just needed space to breathe. Lyra sat in the co-pilot chair, shoulders slightly hunched forward, arms wrapped around herself, not out of fear, but because some realizations live in the marrow. She didn't speak. She just stared at the stars ahead, blinking slowly, as if trying to convince herself that she was no longer inside a memory cage. Kane checked the vitals on the screen. All systems nominal. External threats, none for now. But it wasn't the ship he was worried about. "You should rest," he said quietly. "I'm not tired," she replied, eyes still forward. That wasn't a suggestion. She glanced at him for a long second before finally sighing and leaning back. But instead of closing her eyes, she turned toward him fully. "Did you ever think maybe some people were never meant to survive?" Kane didn't answer right away. He reached over to pour 2 mugs of synth steep, hot, bland, grounding. He passed her one without looking and let the question hang in the air between them. "Survival," he said finally, "isn't about worth. It's about consequence." She sipped the drink. It burned just enough to remind her she was real. "Do you think I'll ever be normal?" He shook his head, not unkindly. "Number. But normal's overrated. Then what am I?" He took a moment before answering. "You're someone who walked through hell and remembered to carry someone else out. That's rare. That's more than normal." She stared at the mug, watching the steam swirl like ghost thoughts. "You think others made it out? Kids like me?" Kane looked at her, then turned to the nav screen. He tapped a few commands and brought up an encrypted comm channel. The signal was old, buried deep in ex-military relay stations, long disused. But Kane had kept it alive. "I've spent years tracking rumors," he said. "Refugee camps, underground transport routes, ex-readers who vanished but never turned up dead." Her eyes lit with something that had nothing to do with hope and everything to do with purpose. "You were looking for them. I was looking for anyone who still had a piece of the light in them. Someone like you." She leaned forward, studying the coordinates he displayed. There was a name she recognized, not a place, a person. "Leora." Kane nodded. "We crossed paths once. She's the one who gave me the code that found you." Lyra's hands trembled slightly. "I thought she died. Most people who matter seem to. That's why I never believed it the first time." She stood, the weight of her new identity settling on her frame like armor. "We need to find her." Kane didn't flinch. "I figured you'd say that." They plotted a course together faster than necessary, but not out of fear. This wasn't flight, this was something else. The freighter hummed back to life. Stars shifted, coordinates locked. As the ship cut a gentle arc through the quiet void, Lyra turned once more to Kane. "Why are you helping me?" He didn't answer right away. He looked out at the dark, the endless sea of stars. "Because someone helped me once," he said, "and because you're the kind of story that deserves to keep being told. Some stories don't end where the book closes. They drift further into the stars, carried by the hearts that survived them." Kane knew this now. Not because someone told him, but because he could feel it pulsing quietly in the silence between systems and the breath of a girl who no longer flinched at shadows. The freighter moved steadily toward the coordinates of a signal buried deep in an asteroid belt far from regulated space. There were no patrols, no relays, no trade routes, just dust and memory, and one beacon still transmitting an old encrypted call sign, Lyra sat at the helm. Now, her fingers on the controls, eyes focused, posture steady. There was no more hesitation in her movements. Kane noticed that first, she belonged in that seat, not because she had trained for it, but because she had earned it. "The signal is getting stronger," she said. "We're close." He nodded, watching the readouts flicker across the console. His hands remained at rest, but his muscles were coiled, as if expecting the unexpected. The asteroid field came into view, jagged rocks turning slowly against the pull of invisible gravity fields, and nestled in the heart of the cluster was a ship, old, scarred alive. Kane angled the freighter alongside the vessel and hailed it. No response, but a docking tunnel extended slowly without command. "They want us in," Lyra said flatly. He checked her face. She wasn't afraid. They docked and entered. Inside was dark, but not empty. Systems still breathed quietly. The corridors were warm, lit faintly by auxiliary power, enough to suggest this place hadn't been forgotten. Then came the voice. Familiar. Not in tone, but in rhythm. "I was wondering when you'd finally trace it." A figure stepped into view, older than Kane remembered her, but with the same fire behind her eyes. "Leora?" Lyra's breath caught not in fear, but recognition. "You're real. Vari and I've been waiting for you." They embraced, not like family, but like survivors of a storm only they could name. Leora turned to Kane. "She's stronger than I imagined," he smiled. Just needed time to remember who she was. Leora gestured them deeper into the ship, through sealed doors, into a hidden chamber. Maps, records, stories. Hundreds of names projected across the walls. Each a child like Lyra who had escaped, who had endured. "You kept track of all of them," Lyra whispered. "The Order wanted minds to weaponize, I wanted minds to heal." They stayed in that room for hours, listening, connecting, weaving a network that had been scattered across light years. When they returned to the freighter, Lyra sat at the nav controls again. Her hands no longer shook, her eyes no longer searched for exits. Where to now? Kane asked. She looked at him with calm certainty. "There's a girl on Trillin's moon taken in the last raid. I think we can find her." He didn't hesitate. "Let's go." As the freighter pulled away, the stars stretched forward, not as threats but as promises. Some journeys are made in silence but end with thunder. And for those watching, perhaps you too have carried something heavy, something unseen. If this story stirred anything within you, tell us. What would you have done if it were your daughter, your memory, your voice left behind in the dark? Comment below. We read every word, because stories like these don't end. They echo.